Yeah.
Do it. Hey everybody, welcome to Sorting Myself Out. My name is Ryan Holsapple. Today I am here with my good pal Dennis Whitt. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, bro.
So basically, you and I are in school together, in graduate school. We're
Hmm.
finishing up our masters this spring and summer. And throughout this time, we've had some incredibly interesting conversations, and we've just continued to connect on that level, and it's been really beneficial. And today, what we're going to share with all of you is kind of the trajectory of some of those conversations, particularly around subpersonalities, Jungian complexes, and archetypes. And that's what we're going to do. So, how's that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great, man. I think since we started school, we kind of hit it off real quickly. And one of the things I think that got us there is it seems to me from our discussions, we tend to center around these same sort of requirements in the way we think, right? Like it's not enough for us to be in one polar way of thinking, you know. And so we try and bring it back, and then we're constantly playing devil's advocate for each other's thoughts, which I think is
Yes.
really productive. So we're getting this dialectical thought going on. So
Yeah, I love that about our conversations too, because we try to tie in metaphysics
yeah,
with, the more genetic level of reality,
yeah.
with kind of the psychological text that we're reading, and not leaving any stone unturned. I think that that's a really important aspect to education, and it seems to me that there's a tendency that people get so myopically involved in their own
Hmm.
field, their own
Right.
perspective, that they start to see the world from this, monocentric viewpoint, and then these
Right.
other important areas get left behind. And then so you're no longer integrating different
Hmm.
aspects of reality. You're simply kind of backed into a corner with one.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, if we get too far, well, even if you think of our school, for instance, why we're there, right? It's kind of nested out in the Santa Barbara Hills, and and it's in its own sort of you know, uh, little bubble, if you will, right? And when you go there, you get a certain flavor for life and a certain way of thinking, and then you go back out into public life and things like that, where put your mask back on, your persona, you go back into your life, and it's easy to get stuck in a pull either way. And the funny thing is, I think is that's not enough for us. So we enrolled in school and went there, but then you have to return to it. So like I think ultimately what we're trying to do is figure out how we can find a balance there and really be ourselves. And one thing that always struck me is that you're always pulling in this sort of genetic component to it, along with making space for the soul and the spirit. And I think that's awesome because then it allows us to really take into account a holistic way of being. So,
Yeah, and we should just go over briefly what that genetic component is. And I'll just preface it with I'm not a geneticist or a scientist myself. However, I consider myself a scientific thinker, and it's very important to me that the research on genetics is incorporated into psychology, and it is in many ways
mhm.
at that point now. However, with the field that we're in, depth psychology, there's been a lack of a voice for the biological level of personality and personality development. And the research overwhelmingly indicates that there are various polygenic, meaning multiple genes, uh,
Mhm.
impacting the personality and who we are as we come into the world as babies and grow into children and then into adults. There are innate personality dispositions, and it's important to remember too that a disposition is not a behavior, it's a
Mhm.
tendency to respond in a specific way, but it's not a behavior in itself. So you might have a disposition towards anger, and that would be considered a subpersonality. But the way that the behavior that manifests itself into is going to be
Mhm.
very specific, and that is not determinism. That is probabilistic. So there are various ways where you can manifest such a disposition as anger. It could be something very overblown and uptight, or it could be just kind of irritable. You know what I mean? There's a
Right.
spectrum for each
Right.
personality, and that goes with curiosity, novelty seeking, threat aversion,
Mhm.
spiritual tendencies. If you and you have kids, man,
Right.
maybe you could just share, just as a parent. Is this a easily observable factor? Does the
Oh
science
yeah.
yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. There's things in there that, it's that sort of nature versus nurture thing, but I mean, what you're talking about seems to be already ingrained in their little beings already, right? And then you can see them kind of manifest, and they adopt traits and tendencies and proclivities and things like that you impart in them. But there's so much that's already there. You can already see it. When this kid was this age, he was that way. When this kid was this age, he was that way. Well beyond the I guess when they've been socialized and things like that, they're already there. You mentioned having proclivities in terms of maybe doing something later in life, or toward anger or something like that, or it could be addiction. The whole spectrum. What kind of led us into one of our chats we had, which is really meaningful to me, was we talked about how there might be, let's say someone's has a family full of public service members, right? And so they're always in service, and everyone fills that role. It's going to be natural, perhaps, to slide into that role even well before you even, came into being. That was already laid there. And if everyone's done that for years and years and years, then chances are, you might have some epigenetic proclivity to do that, right?
Right.
That was something for me to really think about, because, as I was a firefighter. I've been in the military. All my jobs at EMT, all my jobs have been um, centric to public service, even what I do now with veterans. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, why is that? Is that really me? Is that what I'm doing, or was that what I was encultured into?
Mm-hmm.
And and that's revealing, because by going into what you shared with me with Dr. Strachan's model, it enables you to parse that apart and really figure out what parts are there and what parts really have a voice, and what they have to say. And that's like really powerful.
Yeah, man, we had some really powerful
Yeah.
discussions about that. And
Yeah.
yeah, again, with Strachan's model, for those of you who knew, his model is called self, soul, spirit, but it's basically the idea of the genetically based subpersonalities that we come into the world with. And then as we experience life, we grow neural pathways that strengthen
Mm-hmm.
certain behaviors, strengthen certain dispositions. The environment, we have to cope with the environment. So
Yeah.
we bring these dispositions to the life that is in front of us. And as we are coping in our everyday lives, certain personalities gain speed, they gain steam, and they become even more a force of their own.
Yeah.
And like you said, like what our ancestral lineage did and passed down really does matter. And there's one more component to it that's really fascinating too, which is they're called de novo mutations. It's completely new genetic alterations in every single human being that are essentially, scientists call them random, which means they don't know what causes them exactly. But
Mm-hmm.
those also have a heavy impact on our personality. And so when you take all that into consideration, your lineage plus new epigenetic mutations that are
Yeah.
going on, you have something really interesting in a unique individual that's never existed before. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it makes you wonder, like, okay, so with those factors there in place, outside of your conscious choosing, right? Like, how do you live a soul directed life that becomes uniquely yours and is your choice, right? And that's kind of one thing that I got out of that. So I don't know, maybe you want to talk a little bit about, if you want, how that night went, and kind of what we got out of it. I'd be happy to,
Yeah,
if that's
let's.
where you want to go.
I think I know exactly. Are you talking about the night where we went out on the ocean and did our?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of preface it a little bit, and you can share however much you want. But essentially, Dennis and I have been connecting over this self, soul, spirit, subpersonality model, and I was guiding him through how it works, getting him to explore some of his subpersonalities, to speak for them, to deal with life circumstances from these perspectives. And we had this really powerful dialogue, and it really clicked for him, where he was like, oh my God, like this is what the Jungian complexes are. Like this is these subpersonalities, these pieces of who I am, these little perspectives and emotions and various conflicts inside of me. These are like the personalities that make up the complexes in Jungian psychology. And those are also a big part of the archetypes. And you just had this beautiful kind of transformative experience. It was really fun to watch, and it was an honor to be a part of it. And I'd be happy to hear whatever aspects of that you feel inclined to share.
Yeah, so I think, thanks, buddy. The thing I think would be a great place to start was how we ended up kicking it off, right, with this like real powerful synchronicity. So, we'd been kind of dancing around the idea of diving into this kind of thing. And I've always been interested in hearing your experiences and the powerful work that you've engaged in with that. And so naturally, I've had this inclination like, okay, well, what would that be like for me if I kind of dived into it? And we started talking. Here we are, we're walking kind of oriented toward the ocean, right? Which is symbolic of itself. We're going down a pier in the ocean, right? Right into the sort of unconscious, okay? And we have this moment where we're like, okay, will we turn back? Will we dive into this? Or will we, are we going in? Are we, going into the ocean, right?
Right.
And then, dude, like right as that happens, phone rings. And it was a really significant call because it dealt with, it was at the root. The person who was calling was at the root of some of what we were going to deal with and jump into.
Which was really odd.
It was like, okay, if there's such thing as a synchronicity, it had to be that, because it's very, very rare that this individual calls. So we both look at each other and we're like, okay, we're doing this.
We got to do this.
So yeah. And so that's neat, right? So like, first of all, how the heck does that work? Is that a mere coincidence or is it something more? And if you attribute meaning to it, then I think it becomes something more. And so taking that cue, we kind of went out to the pier and started dealing with some of the complexes, actually identifying them, which we had done sort of prior, following your cue on, if you don't mind me saying, all the different ones that you have on your mirror that I saw,
right,
that you had brought with you.
All the different subpersonalities, yeah.
And so I'm like thinking, okay, look, if those are existent in Ryan, then there's probably some similar dynamic at play in me. And so I just started jotting them down and refining them from the last time we met to now. And so I already kind of had an image of who they were and was used to somewhat hearing them speak. As in, through my actions and through my feelings at the time of the day, because we kind of float through those voices, and some speak more than others, right? So I've had I served in the military for a while. I was a military officer in the infantry, which I loved, man. There's nothing I love talking about more than experiences with soldiers and that whole dynamic. So much so, transitioning out of the military and into what I do now, working with veterans, it's still so dominant, but it's in a different role. And that's something that's harder, right? Because the psyche maybe doesn't necessarily, those personalities don't necessarily understand that. And what we had to do that night was get this subpersonality that we dubbed Commander, right?
Commander.
And get Commander to have like a new mission.
Yes.
Speak to the Commander in the language he's used to, but bring him fully integrated into that dynamic of the psyche and give him a new role and a new mission. And it's so cool, man. Just to see how that really works and how it fits.
And how has that impacted you since we did that exercise?
Oh, profoundly. I feel happier, hands down. I feel definitely more integrated overall. I feel more aware of who I am and how I act throughout the day. And I'm more aware. I think here's what's real key. And I don't want to mess up this quote, but I was listening to something from Dr. Lionel Corbett, and someone asked him in a clip, they said, well, what's the point of doing this work? And he said something like, well, you get to know your own shadow and then you do less harm to the world. And I hope I didn't butcher that, but that's the way I remembered it. And I thought, wow, you know, that's cool. I'm being kinder to myself. And if I can understand that about myself and I'm feeling good, then I'm putting out a better energy to those around me. When I have that complex, if you will, that subpersonality better integrated and nested underneath the direction of my soul.
Yeah, and you did such a great job doing it. It was such a powerful night. And you were switching between the subpersonalities. You would be the commander, and then you would shift into the other parts, and you would
Mm-hmm.
have these full on dialogues. And it was so natural. It just came. It just came so easily. And at the same time, even though there were difficulties and tensions involved,
Mm-hmm.
there was this sense of fluidity and trust that came out of that. This sense of soul,
Yeah.
this deepening of consciousness, this attentiveness paid to your personality. And I think it was in one of the books we had for class by Robert Avens where he says attention breaks the spell.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we pay
Yeah, man.
attention to ourselves, to the different personalities and dynamics within us, and we give them that real mindful focus, there's a way in which things loosen up. It breaks the spell. It can kind of loosen up the complex in which we're immersed in. Where you know, we get stuck in these mental ruts
Right.
where we go over the same thing over and over again, and we
Yeah.
might even repeat the same dialogue inadvertently in our head without really giving it the attention it deserves. And then when we stop and we pause and we say, what's really going on here?
Yeah.
And then we explore it, we lean into it. That's the essence of transformation. That's going into the unknown and exploring it forthrightly and having faith that the outcome of that will be something good. And
Yeah.
and it's scary because you don't know that. You don't know if it's going to be okay in that moment because you're really exploring something new.
Right. And one could say that too, that the dominant personalities are frightened too, or apprehensive, or they want their place, the place that they're so used to being, right?
Yes.
And so, and we can't really see when we're stuck or we're caught in the grips of a complex, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
we can't see the shadow side of it, right? So you need to have that movement you're talking about to be able to move into another one, to move into that position that the soul play takes within that model, so that it can be the one directing it. It can see and it can comment and say, "Hey, look, maybe you're being this way here, Commander, or little boy, or
Right,
whatever,
right,
or provider, or and you can see the vantage that you otherwise cannot see when you're caught in the grips of a complex, right?"
right. And we should just explain briefly what a complex is. Do you want to try to tackle that?
Why don't I let you do that while I sip some water here?
All right, fine. So a complex is basically life is anything in life is considered a Jungian complex. A complex is kind of the force that creates the prerequisite tension that allows us to have a perspective, to have an action, to act from a subpersonality, to embody something. So everything is a complex. It's not just a bad thing. Now, there
Mm-hmm.
are what Jung called negative complexes, where you are sort of stuck in a mindset that is not in service of your soul. That is not it's not fully embodied in a wholehearted way that would be the best manifestation of who you are. That would be called the soul directed life. So those complexes can be really difficult, whether it's a complex could be getting pissed off in traffic and flipping someone
Right.
off, or it could be getting angry with your wife, or it could be depression could be a complex. So a complex is something that has a personality at the core of it. And that personality could be called an archetype, and that
Mm-hmm.
archetype could be considered as a perspective that wants something, that needs something, that has its own motivations for existence, and that
Mm-hmm.
in Hillman's terms would be considered a god. You know, it would be
Right.
considered a powerful entity that's demanding a sacrifice. It's demanding you pay tribute to it. And so a complex is this kind of rich way in which our psychological life is animated. And there's complexes are sometimes made up of various subpersonalities. So one personality wants one thing while another personality wants another thing, and there you have a conflict. Or you could
Mm-hmm.
have two personalities that are in, they're in coordinates with each other. They're acting together to achieve a goal. So that's kind of the territory of complexes. It's an incredibly deep subject that demands a lot of explanation, but that's a somewhat decent introduction.
Yeah, great job. And I think that an important thing to note too is that we're encouraged to look at these complexes as autonomous living beings, right? As having life,
Yes.
right? Not as being just like a theoretical abstract model, but to live them so that we can experience them and then,
that's key.
Build soul, right? So outside of depth psychology, and I don't want to totally generalize, but outside of it, and maybe in some areas that circles we've been in mainstream psychology, quote unquote, there's an emphasis maybe on the biological functions to the extreme, in that it divorces the human being maybe from the recognition that there's soul and spirit within that dynamic.
Yes.
Whereas here, through this type of work, it says, wait a sec, not only do they exist, but they're fundamental to our well-being.
Yes.
Right? So I don't want to say that something like, CBT and, cognitive behavioral therapy in accompaniment with, SSRIs, some medication, like it won't be effective. I mean, that's empirically proven that it helps people, right?
Right.
But we're arguing that there's also a part within the psyche that demands that we reconnect with these, as you refer to them, gods, if that's the terminology we like to use, or autonomous living forces, energies.
Personalities,
and what I want to stress,
whatever.
Yeah, I'm sorry, say again.
Subpersonalities, whatever you want to call
them. Yeah,
them.
whatever you want to call them, whatever language you feel comfortable with giving them recognition that they exist, right? Because to use, one of Jung's more popular quotes is something to the effect of, anything that's unconscious is going to make itself conscious, and you'll refer to it as fate if you don't.
Right. It's going to play itself out in your life either way.
Yeah.
So if it's like Socrates' quote, the unexamined life is not worth living, because if it goes unexamined, it sneaks through the back door and takes control. Yeah. It's like a thief in the night, and then all of a sudden you have a cathartic breakdown, or you're very angry at someone and you can't figure out why, or one day everything falls apart, or if we don't pay attention to our various subpersonalities, our complexes, they will have a way of making themselves known one way or another. They will demand. And it reminds me of one of our great professors, Dr. Slater. He wrote a beautiful piece called Resync the Titanic. Yeah. And he's talking about the relationship between the Titans and the Olympian gods, and how they were banished to the bottom of the ocean, and how it was very ironic that the ship, the Titanic, was named after this horrifyingly, poor myth. It was a poor model to base your boat after. So he was talking about the irony, but also that when we fail to make the proper sacrifice to the gods, and we have the hubristic notion of trying to usurp or to suppress or to ignore, then the sacrifice is demanded by force. So the sacrifice it pushes itself upon you. So you could think of that like there's many examples, like being an addict. If you fail to recognize the addiction as something that's important to address, then eventually there's something called rock bottom that addicts hit, and that sacrifice is demanded because it wasn't made by choice earlier on. So there's this essence of soul and choice, that when we're living in a soul-directed way, we're making choices that we make the proper sacrifices beforehand, so that we don't have to have these compelled sacrifices later.
Yeah, very good. I think that what's really interesting is, look at your channel, look at your and look at what it's a part of. It's emblematic of like greater society. So I know you're real influenced by, Jordan Peterson, things like that. Look at how that's sprung out in a veritable movement out of the collective unconscious, if you will. Okay, so you've got, 37,000 followers roughly?
Yeah, but it's we don't get that many views on every video, so that's a bit of a misleading number.
But you've got that many people, just as a small testament to a piece like a like a sub piece in this movement. That's the way I see it, as a sub
Yeah.
piece of a larger, greater movement of the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Um, People trying to sort themselves out, if you will, right? Like, where is that coming from? That's so interesting to me. I
Right.
mean, the people who might be tuned in right now, or anyone who might watch this down the road, are drawn to this kind of work. I mean, that's like really, really profound. We've got this thing called the internet, right? So people can connect. We can be, arguably, we can be more isolated. You know, everything you can turn on your TV. You don't even have to really go out. You can call Amazon. You can be more and more introverted, if you will, and hunker down in your own bunker, quote unquote. But like, yet we have this medium where we can connect more deeply, and people are getting that urge to do that in spite of a contracting social world. And so that's just really like infinitely interesting to me, because it's like a collective movement to try and look inward. We're finding that we have this crisis of soul, or that it's not being met. And so we want to meet up. We want to have these discussions. And that to me is like, I almost see that as the most profound part of it all.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and you'll see, like, in society at large, we're looking at media, for example, all the different ways that we take in entertainment and information has gotten so crazy and accessible,
Yeah.
and it's just everywhere, and how surface level it's been for so long. You know, the television, the different things on cable TV, the way that the
Right.
news is reported, and there's this kind of lack of connection in that. And then in this thing, YouTube, and in these other platforms, there's this kind of underground movement of depth happening. It's almost as if the soul is demanding. It's like demanding that there's room for it in this
That's exactly what I mean.
technological world.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And that's what's so inspiring to me, is that you think, wow, you're really not in this alone. You're not the only one feeling this way. You're not the only one who wants to connect with their soul.
Right.
Because so easily can it go into, this like woo-woo place, if you will. But you go, wait a second, it is real. It is real inside of us. There is a pull toward it. And that dynamic's been at play, unconscious. So, being able to do that kind of work takes a dive. You really do have to dive into the water. And those complexes, they don't want to release the hold they have, right? Because that's going to mean that maybe they have to change. So
yeah, that's a big part. Like if any given personality, subpersonality within us is asked to make a shift in perspective or a shift in role, and to come along with a new intention, it can be a very painful process. And it can be a huge sacrifice. It's, I'm often reminded of the part of me that I call the challenger, and remembering my teenage years where I was a hothead and I could just go off at any minute. And to get that part of me to integrate it into adulthood, so where it could be an assertive ally rather than a detrimental, self-destructive force, was a lot of work. It was a lot of work to integrate that, to shift that perspective for me.
Yeah, and the work kind of continues, right? I mean, isn't that sort of the way that we, if I recall, if you don't mind me saying, it's kind of the way we became buddies, right?
Yeah. No, you can say whatever you want about me on here.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
So I see that as a really cool quality about you, man, because you harness it in a powerful way. So, we're in class. I think it was my first time with the cohort, and something kind of sparked, and me and you both felt the same way.
Right.
And you kind of jumped in and were ready to go like full challenger, right?
Oh, dude, I was full challenger. Yeah.
Yeah, but
this is bullshit. Like this whole situation.
Here's the cool part, though, is it carries this awesome, fantastic energy, right? Which I saw that and I was like, all right, I like this dude, right on.
Right.
Yeah. And so that was like acted like a magnet, right? But it's so powerful that it can push some people away. It could, right? So like, if I can talk about one of mine, I can say that my commander, it's been a powerful part that's got me through some very hard times. Literally has exactly what the name entails. But that isn't a complete being, right? It's a being that serves a function or serves multiple functions, but it can't serve everything. So it can't be the way that a provider needs to be, right? In terms of like with my kids, if I walk around being like, hey, you're the commander, you're in the front lean rest position, like a push-up position, that's not going to be conducive to kids, right? It'll be conducive maybe to soldiering.
Right.
but it's not going to be for kids, and it's certainly not going to be that way for the individual who the complex inhabits. It's not going to be good for that person, i.e. me, to
Yes.
behave that way constantly. And that was something that, as you were sort of the guide through discussing that, I really realized, I'm like, wow, I can weaponize, to use a term, I can kind of weaponize my commander in
Yeah.
certain ways. If I have to write a 15-page paper, I can really go, okay, commander, it's time for you to like show up, order things, and then be timely and crank it out with discipline.
That's such a
But
beautiful example. It's
right.
so that's so important, and Strachan really hammered this home in my training with him. The context. It's like what's functional in one situation might not be functional in another. So like at
Right.
one point when you were the commander of your guys, when you had all those guys underneath you in the military, and it was functional to have that be positioned in a particular way, and then
Mm-hmm.
come back to civilian life, and it's like, oh shit, like this isn't functioning as well as it was. And
Right.
that's like the essence of like this is the essence of this work is that things pop up, they're functional, and then
Mm-hmm.
life changes. Things
Yeah.
move around, and then like things that were functional yesterday aren't functional today, or things that were functional last year
Yeah.
aren't working this year. And so to be introspective enough to say, okay, what's going on here? Who inside of me is holding on and resisting the change?
Right.
And how can I start to pry into and alleviate this dynamic and shift things around from a soulful perspective, meaning a deeply meaningful and connected perspective, so that my life is really arranged in such a
Yeah.
way that I'm responding appropriately to each situation?
Yeah. Yeah. Great summation. I think we could return to Hillman and Jung, and we could say that, soul being tied with life, like this desire for life, for the daily living, for the creation of soul through experience and living. That's the cool part, because you're reminded that you create your soul. At least that's the perspective I've been taking. Before, I thought of it as this sort of abstract thing that, like, yeah, okay, I have a soul, or maybe I don't. I mean, I don't know. But then you start to take possession of it through the way you live, and take on the responsibility for creating your soul, and that is made daily through your life
Mm.
and the way you behave and the dynamics. And you touched on that term dynamics there for a second, and that's the beautiful thing about the psyche, is that it is ever changing, and what was useful yesterday maybe needs to be readjusted to continue to serve the soul
Yes.
tomorrow or today or maybe in this moment, right?
Yes.
And it gives you the power when you realize that dynamic, and that you do have the power to kind of alter that and tweak it. I mean, in a way, you're really creating, hermetically, you're creating your internal reality, and then it's manifesting outside.
Yes.
Now, I can cross over really easily into that woo-woo space, but we'll keep it kind of centered here. You really are in charge. Your soul is in charge of the way that you behave, and the way you feel,
Yes.
and then how you carry yourself. And that's like, just, it's amazing. It's amazing when you can take the reins and you can take the seat of the soul, and then
Yes.
direct those subpersonalities.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Yeah, so and I've come to find that it's both essential and existential, in this sense that the Sartre quote, existence precedes essence. Like, we exist, and then we have to decide what we're made of. That's kind of the soul making James Hillman perspective. We have to make our
Right.
soul. I kind of tread a middle space where I feel like, for me at least, I have a sense inside of me that there is something of origin, and whether it's just the basic spark of life inside me as an
Right.
individual, or whatever, the divinity, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And so I have that, and then it's like, it's what I do with that makes it or breaks it. It's like, how am I going to manifest? Am I going to foster this? Am I going to nurture it? Am I going to feed it? Or am I going to ignore it and starve it? And a starving soul it's a dangerous thing, because then we fall prey to all sorts of what you could call pathological states of mind, because we've refused to acknowledge that piece of us within. So yeah, for me, it's like that middle ground. It's like, it's not full existential, but it's not full like essentialism. It's somewhere in between.
Yeah, the middle's a good place to be, right? The middle path, right? Because
Yeah.
if we if we sort of look at the metaphor of the peaks and the valleys, the vales, things like that, right? Through Hillman, who's talking about how, a lot of times we get, and this is the way I interpret it, we get so caught in wanting to live on the peaks, right? With this, where the spirit, this like reaching toward something higher than us.
Yeah.
We're not with the, we're not present. We're not with the self. I mean,
Yeah.
that's great. We're going to be on peaks periodically. It's going to feel great when we're there. But when we live constantly there and we're constantly leaping, you could take a bad fall.
Yeah.
You could fall off that peak.
Like Icarus, right?
Right, precisely.
Right.
Just like Icarus, his wings burnt and he fell. He went a little too close.
Right.
Now, the soul calls us into those grottos and those deep, deep areas of daily living. But you can't really live underground either, too, right? Because then you might become a shade, meaning you're not living in the physical realm.
Right.
But it's to be found. That's why it's so neat to read like the look at romanticism, art from the Romantic era, in the mid 1800s, things like that. I really tend to like them. In fact, if I could show, I'd look around my room right now and there's all these pictures of mountains. There's like Caspar David Friedrichs and did several of his paintings, and they're all, I just noticed this actually, they're all mountain peaks. And you probably remember in a lot of my stuff from class, all my like dream-centered work, things like that, all center around mountains and valleys. They really do. And It just like hit me upside the head the other day. I'm like, oh my gosh, I surround myself with these ideas. And it's like they've emphasized the peaks, but there's always at the bottom this well, this or lake or pond or what have you. Each one of them shows that right now, all the 4 that I'm looking at in my room. And it's been around me. I've surrounded myself with these. It's like, why have I done that? And maybe it's to get off the peaks. I'm drawn to them, but the soul making is in the vales. And what we mean by that is walking through the woods, walking through the forest, taking that time, enjoying what nature provides. And that's what all the Romantic era poets talk about. It's like being alive, being temporal, enjoying the forest, trying to connect with nature.
Yeah.
And I noticed, returning to what you're saying, I do notice that your inclination to want to stay with the spark. And that's always intrigued me because, like I'm saying, I'm always going like, well, what's beyond? How can we rise? How can we move into this mystical, if you will, area? But I'm kind of realizing that maybe you do that through just living.
Yeah, that's beautifully leaning into life.
Yeah.
There's been a real transcendence model that you see especially in the self-help industry today, where there's this idea of bigger, better, faster, stronger, transcend. But what gets left behind in that is this grounded sense of just being, right? This beingness that also needs to be included. This going in, like walking through the valley. What does Christ say? As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. There's something about the soul that needs to be in that valley, that needs to explore the full spectrum of the landscape of life. Right. So I love that.
Yeah, that middle way, right?
Middle way. That's a good way to put it. From a Buddhist perspective, it's not too hot, not too cold, but just right.
Well, most of our culture tends to emphasize that. I mean, you see it, right, in Western culture, and it's brought a lot of fantastic things to the world. I mean, we're connecting right now in this moment in time over the internet, which is great. But it does tend to do that. It tends to have a sort of transient in that we just keep moving through onto the next thing without enjoying. And if there is a pathway, it does what you're saying, like it emphasizes the transcendence. So it even carries over to the impulses where we're looking to overcome problems, when really I think we find the answer in reflecting inward instead of like projecting outward and always looking outward. It's like, the answer's already in you. It's already in there. And it's where you least want to find it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's the alchemist thing that Jung unraveled. What you most need to find is where you least want to look. And
yeah, man. Is that anything anyone wants to hear?
No.
Is that what your subpersonalities want to hear? They're probably, I would imagine them shaking in their boots going like, oh crap, someone's going to examine me.
Right.
Like, put it under the microscope.
Right. Yeah.
So there's that resistance.
Resistance is huge. Resistance You see it in working with clients or just in doing the work on my own. There can be sometimes for some people be a sense of, oh, don't poke there, because
Yeah.
what's underneath that is God knows what's going to happen if we take a look at that, or
Yeah.
if we pop open the hood and look at what's going on down there. And so there's this shallow insistence to keep on just living life as it is in
Right.
this everyday, what Heidegger calls everyday averageness, just
Mm.
going on and on and on. Or what Thoreau says, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. There's just this way in which that little moment of choice where that person turns away from themselves and says, I don't want to know what's over there. That moment, as insignificant as it feels, is so consequential, because it leads to this monotony. It leads to this averageness. It leads to this life of despair where you never really leaned in. And you can do that for your whole life. Many people do.
Right. Yeah, isn't that the tragedy if someone lives a whole life and then looks back and ends up now having to confront those things when they don't have the time to do it?
Yes. It's a tragedy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the saddest things that could happen.
Yeah, so I guess is that sort of the impetus for the channel and what's underlying underneath the whole movement going on? It's like, okay, examine your life, figure it out. We have to do that.
Yeah, I think so, man. I think, like we mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier, I think he was the catalyst for a lot of what's going on. Obviously, he's the reason that this channel has a following, at least him and Andrew, the guy who started it. But yeah, there's this real sense of need right now. And Peterson is a pragmatist. For him, it's about living a life that works in society, integrating yourself into civilization, sorting yourself out. He's very good at that side of things. I think what sometimes gets missed in that, and I'm not sure if this is absolutely true or not, but for me, what sometimes gets left behind in that is this sense of connection. And actually, if you live a soulful life in a cabin in the middle of nowhere and you're not, a part of society, that to me is just as valuable. There's not this, they're both valuable either way, whichever way you go. But the soul doesn't need one particular manifestation or another to live on its own merits. In my estimation.
I think one thing that it seems to me what's had many of us latch on to what he has to say, what Dr. Peterson has to say, is the way he's able to articulate messages. He can transmit them in a way that I would say we have a proclivity to learn and take in data, right?
Yes.
So in what we do in school, we returning to the gods and things like that. That's probably an idea that for a lot of people that would be like, well, what the heck? We know that, there's no, bearded guy in the sky kind of thing. Right. But right now we're trying to figure out a way to still acknowledge what exists inside of us, but within the framework of the dominant sort of rational mind, egoic mind, if you will. And he's able to do that by translating those stories and things in a fantastic way. And I think that's what we're trying to get at in school is use these tools that are there, these stories, messages, myths, and things, because they still do speak to us, but we're trying to inculcate them into our being in a way that we can understand with the rational faculty. Which I don't know that was there in the sense that we have it now dominant today as it may have been for the Greeks, right? So maybe who's to say? We don't know that consciousness evolves. That's one thing that always we know that consciousness evolves. I would posit we do. We might not have looked at the world through the same eyes as the Greeks did, or as the Germanic people, or so on and so forth through time. We take for granted, I think, that the body might have evolved. Everyone goes, oh, Darwinism? Yeah, sure, we know that. We can look at anthropology or something like that and see, that famous picture where it shows like the monkey, and then like the bipedal ape, and kind of walking into man, caveman. We kind of take that for granted, but what was the psyche doing through this time? It was dynamically evolving too, and it was taking all those things with it, and they're still in you. And there's also parts that have developed. And I think that the rational mind has been developed.
Yeah, and
And
that's a really good. That we just picked up McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, where his argument is essentially that the left the left brain has evolved past its rightful place as the emissary and has now is now overserving its purpose. Kind of like when we talked about a subpersonality that can
Mhm.
begin to
Yeah,
overserve its purpose. In his estimation, the left brain has begun to do that in our Western civilization, and we need a radical shift in consciousness that allows us to see the nonlinear beauty and sense of things that doesn't fit into the hard-lined ways that the left brain views things. And he's also very quick to note that this isn't like the mainstream understanding of the left brain and right brain that gets misrepresented in corporate trainings and
right.
new age books, but really like this is a deeply scientific exploration, and it's embedded in philosophy, and it's really cool to see what he's talking about. And in many ways, you could look at it and say, okay, so these ancient civilizations that you're talking about, like Greece or primitive peoples, they had this, what I think he would see as a very right-brained mode of seeing things, that reality was made sense of phenomenologically, and it was made sense of not from this like Cartesian dualist place where there's
Right.
subjects and objects and you can
Right.
measure space and everything's time, everything's based on time and space, but in the sense that what's occurring phenomenologically for the person, whether they're experiencing gods and demons or they have mythologies that really resonate with them deep inside. That was like the way the world was navigated. It wasn't from this place of, cold measure and calculation.
Right. Well, those things have served a distinct purpose. I mean, they've got us here, so we can't say like,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, rationality is totally cold and
Oh
it's
no.
past its time." Like we have to keep that. That's the problem. Is like, we can't cast out one thing and then try and fill it exclusively with the other. If we have a developed rationality, if we will, that ordered thinking you're talking about,
Right.
well, we're going to have to keep that.
Right.
And maybe just like a complex, if it's gotten too far out of range and it's shot itself way up here to the dominant position at the expense of another, and maybe that's what it takes to fully develop one, then you
Right.
have to somehow like bring it back into equilibrium, into that comfortable, healthy place, where
Yes.
they're balanced out. And I think maybe that's what we're trying to do.
Well, that's even what he says in the book, is there has to be a balance between science, reason, or rationality,
Right.
what was it, intuition, and imagination. Those were like, he was like, if any one of these things is left out, like it's incomplete. And so
Right.
what he's basically saying is right now we've put a lot of weight into science, and rationality, and then where's the imagination and intuition fitting in? I think that's part of what he's saying.
Yeah. Well, some folks want to throw it out. They want to go, okay, they want to run for the hills and go like, okay, we're
Right.
getting away from science and things like that.
Right. Exactly. Well, and
Can't
me.
do that.
I mean, you know that. Like, I get pretty frustrated when people do that, as you've probably witnessed in our conversation. Yeah, exactly.
No, I
get-
like that. It's cool. No,
Yeah.
it's cool. It's because it's important. It's keeping emphasis on it. But and sometimes we'll retreat to our dialogues and we'll talk about, well, man, we'll kind of I sense that we're recentering ourselves because we're so far in an emphasis of the spirit kind of, or the soul area, right?
And the
That's
imaginal.
what
Yeah.
to do it. That's what it's doing there. That's what we're doing there. But then we want to return back to that balance, that equilibrium.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I get pissed on if somebody overemphasizes science and reductionism, or if somebody overemphasizes imagination, like Hillman's imaginal reductionism, which he literally says, I'm an imaginal reductionist, which is just a silly thing, a silly position, even though he's a brilliant psychologist, or was. But to me, it's like, okay, so we've got these components of these epistemological ways of knowing, right? These ways of seeing, these ways of experiencing the world, and they all have a different gift. They all have a different asset within
Yeah.
that, or assets. And wouldn't it be foolish to say, oh, I only want these assets over here, but I'm not interested in those right there that are available to me? It would be silly not to, like, that's why I love when you look at Peterson's lectures on phenomenology. He integrates neuroscience into it. It's really cool. And it's like,
Right.
whoa, there's this really interdisciplinary mode of thinking and perceiving that includes all these different bits of information and these perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's just you'd be cheating yourself rather than augmenting yourself by discarding what's on the cutting edge, right?
Exactly.
Look, you could say the same thing about going deeper into the soul. We're rediscovering the depths that you can go into the soul too, right? So you can't throw that out or go retreat fully into science at the expense of the soul. So
no, and I think with science, people get, like, people who are more on the imaginal side of things, or the artistic way of seeing the world. I think with science, people get freaked out that science is a certain, it's like a certain way of taking over everything and putting it through its perspective. And I think that, for me, I just look at it as information. It's like, okay, so they're measuring these components that are observable through these, very disciplined studies, and they're using rigorous logic to try to find out different truths about the objective world. That's fantastic. Also, they're not going to have an easy time measuring how to have a good day.
Yeah.
Or
right.
how to live a meaningful life. So it has its limitations, but it's just more information for us to integrate. It's not the be all end all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, why do you think you're okay with that, whereas some other people might not be?
I think people have a hard time with ambiguity and holding the tension of opposites, and I think people have a hard time holding two. It's like the subpersonalities we were talking about. It's like one subpersonality really wants to go eat chocolate right now, and the other one's on a rigorous diet, and there's a war going on inside about who's going to get what, and that and so the soul's job is to hold the tension. Well, I think the same thing happens is people have a hard time holding the tension, so they jump to one side. Yeah. Because the tension can be kind of unbearable. And it's like, okay, so you have this way of seeing the world that's very scientific, that can be a little bit reductionistic, and that tends to make sense of things in that way. Then you've got this way of seeing the world where everything is synchronicity and everything is about the imagination, and you create your own reality, and there is no such thing as limitation or whatever, just taking another extreme example.
Yeah.
And it's like you sit in between these two things, and if you're not really careful and observant, it could be easy to jump on one side or the other.
I think that's really interesting. That's interesting. It reminds me of a conversation we were having one evening about how, like, the genetic influence, if you will, that might be contained in your DNA. You might be inclined to be a mathmatician or something like that, right? You might have that genetic predisposition to be a mathematician or someone in the hard sciences, a neuropsychologist, something like that. But yet maybe some of your ancestors, maybe thousands of years ago, and for a very long time, your family had the tradition of being the, tribe's shaman or something like that. Right. And so maybe that has come uniquely in you. Both of those different dynamics, those seemingly opposing poles, have come as a manifestation into your genome, into your DNA, as who Ryan is. And that's really cool, man, because really then it really does make you feel totally unique, because you might be able to totally balance that. Maybe that's why you're good at holding that tension, because you have the perfect substrata with which to balance this dynamic, maybe. Whereas maybe
that's an interesting idea.
Maybe the hard thing is, maybe some people don't.
Yeah,
maybe it's
that's the hard thing that people. I mean, that's one of the hardest truths that you can say, is that so it's just like. It's like some people just don't come in with the same hardware as others. And that's a hard truth for people to wrestle with. It's like, try being like Elon Musk. Work as hard as you can to be like Elon Musk. You won't, unless you have that type of intelligence, that kind of brain that his genes wired, it's not gonna happen. And I think people struggle with that hard truth of there are things in life that we have very many potentials, and everybody's unique and has a different potential for being, and that also means that there are there's certain boundaries that we're going to come up against in our ability. I mean, he might not be very good at socializing. I don't know. He might
Right.
have his own boundaries, but the fact is that everybody has them. Everybody has them.
Yeah, and they're going to come out in your subpersonalities. They're
Yeah.
going to behave that way
Right.
because of that, right?
Yes.
So maybe one of your subpersonalities is the very dominant learner or scientist. I don't know. Maybe I have one called the scientist. I don't know. But maybe that person is always trying to come into dominance in opposition with the shaman, if you
Right.
have one like
Right.
that. You
Yeah. That makes
kind of
sense.
continue this on, because that is going to be the hard, uncomfortable part. Is
Yes.
that, return to what we were saying earlier, is like you have to go back. It's going to cause you to look back at that unexamined, darker, more mysterious shadow side of you.
Yes.
And that's hard. That's a hard work that we're, again, resistant to doing. So
Yes. Yeah. That's beautifully put. And we all have our blind spots. We all have areas where,
most certainly.
yeah, I mean, everybody does. It doesn't matter how much
Well,
work you've done on yourself.
that's the cool part about that model. I found it was so neat, is that you were able to slide really well into that guide, and then you were able to jump in and be like, hey, this is Ryan, your buddy, your friend speaking. Now this is like the guide, and that was really cool too, because
Yes.
it aids in that dynamic.
Yeah, I love that way of working because it's so authentic. It's like, this is the part of me that you're talking to right now. This is the part of me that you're engaged with, and it's so honest. And it's like, I do that with my partner sometimes. She'll be like, well, are you saying that you don't want to do that? And I'll be like, well, this part of me doesn't want to do that, and this part of me does want to do that. Like, like that's just the
That's
reality.
so cool. Yeah. As opposed to dancing around something and being like, well, what do you want to hear? Or, and then, you're not being as authentic.
Right.
But you can really voice those things even in that moment. You got to that position because you're able to hear those different voices speaking at that time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then, it's about making that soul directed choice. It's like, oh, this part of me wants this part of me wants that, and then bringing mindfulness to it, and just, I don't think there is a right or wrong choice. It's just whatever is deeply feeling connected to you in the moment. I don't think there's no guidebook to life that says you should live your life this way on Tuesdays and this way on Saturdays. I mean, there is a guidebook that is like that called the Bible, but the point is that, like, that's not really looking within. There is no like answer out there like you talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, but it's also beautiful because it allows you to, if you're caught in the grips of a dominant complex, then you're living your life going, oh gosh, you're constantly seeing the lens you're looking through that complex's lens at your life. And so you're going, oh man, I have to do this. I'm stuck in the job being this person, or I have to behave this way. But you can step out of that and do exactly what you're referring to. You're more present. You're living. You are experiencing life. You're not constantly living in, oh man, I made a mistake, years ago, or I have to be this thing later. Because that right there, I think, is where the complexes are really dominating you, and you're not understanding it. You're caught in it. You're miserable. You're still stuck, right? If I'm still thinking like, oh man, I got to be the commander, I'm not anymore. I'm not in that role.
Right.
But the commander's saying, like, you have to behave this way, or things were like this then.
Right.
Whereas if you can bring to the surface by letting these other voices speak, then you can be who you are right now, who you're feeling at this very moment, and being present, which is something that, like, I know I keep harping on it, but it's something that I just was missing out on for a very long time.
Yeah, well, you latched onto it and you made it real for yourself, and that's the difference between, like, this kind of work gets exposed to people, and some people latch onto it and they take it seriously and they have these amazing insights, and others it kind of fizzles out because they don't do the work. And so it's kind of silly and simple to say, but it's like, if you work on it, it'll work for you.
Yeah,
And
totally.
it's that mundane, it's that easy to understand. And if you don't, then it won't work. It's like
Right.
there's no replacement for time and attention and effort.
Yeah. Yeah, I really do feel like we're on the crest of an unconscious wave coming out of the ocean, and that we're right there. We're kind of there's a lot of waves crashing, right? There's a lot of them moving in and coming out of the unconscious, but we're definitely on one. We're there. Your listeners, your subscribers are there. They're at some point within that wave as it's cresting and turning over, and that's so exciting to me because you feel, I live in my head a lot. And I think, oh, well, who feels the way I do? And I like to absorb a lot of information, but to live it and be allowed to live it and know that there's other people out there living it too is really encouraging and very cool and makes it all the more real.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's been like an honor to explore all this stuff with you, man. It's been really fun.
Yeah, I think we'll keep doing that for sure.
What I'd like to do is have you on again and talk
Cool.
about your experience in the military.
Okay, yeah, man, that'd be fun. If
Yeah.
people are into that, I can speak to it in a limited way. I'm certainly not like a, super cool war hero, but I've got some stories and things like that. And maybe there's some listeners there who would like to hear what that's all
I
about.
think they would. I think that, I mean, you can tell us in the comments, but I think that people would be interested in hearing what it was like to be at the head of your men, guiding them, leading them, and training with them. And what was this experience like psychologically? What did you learn about life? I mean, you shared with me, it's like, yeah, one what was it like? I slept like, this ridiculously small amount for a month straight, like 2 hours
Yeah.
a night or something.
Yeah, that's kind of a normal thing.
Yeah, like I just would, but that's not a normal thing, Dennis, for most people. Like
Yeah, that's
you
what's
know
hard.
what I
That's what's
mean?
hard for me to
It's
remember,
normal
though,
for
right?
like you and everybody that's been in that
Yeah,
experience, but that's like a small sliver of the population. And I think that people hearing stories about what it's like to be in these situations, it's illuminating and it's helpful and it's inspiring. It's like, holy shit, how did you do that? How did you live that life? And to me, that's just it's a cool perspective as a listener to put yourself through.
yeah, Ryan, that'd be cool, man. I'm always uh, hesitant to jump into that because I mean the people around you when you're doing it are working harder, doing harder things, and it's amazing. And
Yeah,
always, like,
and you're
looking around,
very
but
modest
yeah,
and humble, and yeah, well, and I get all that. And the other thing is you could weave in your experience as your psychological expertise, and looking back on it retrospectively, what does it say about the psyche? What does it say about yours and the people that you were with
yeah.
and things like that? It just would
Oh
be
yeah,
it's
dude,
just an
I'd
interesting
love to do it.
opportunity. Yeah,
Absolutely love to do it. It'd be fun. If you have me back, I'd love to do it, man.
let's make it happen, man.
Okay, cool,
Anything
brother.
else you want to share before we wrap up here?
Um, your guys, everyone who tunes in seems to have a pretty good vibe. So, yeah, dude, it's pretty cool. Nice to be here amongst friends and good people.
You know,
And I always enjoy talking to you.
yeah, you as well, man. Thank you so much for coming on. It's so funny. It's like I just feel like we barely scratched the surface today.
Yeah, well, I guess that leaves a lot of area to depth to dive into.
Yeah, absolutely. All right,
Cool.
brother. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Take care, everybody. See ya.